Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Gray. I'm the Chief Experience Officer at the Marketing Science Institute. MSI is a nonprofit membership organization that brings together top marketers and academics. We are at the forefront of marketing science and research and provide highly focused academic research, data, and industry-leading events that help businesses stay at the forefront of an ever-changing environment. Now I'd like to introduce you to today's featured speaker. Sharon Shavitt is the Walter H. Stellner Professor of Marketing at the University of Illinois at Urbana. Sharon's research focuses primarily on the cross-cultural factors affecting consumer persuasion, attitudinal and value judgments, and survey responding. I'll ask Sharon to give you a little bit more background on her research interests, and at the end of this session, Sharon will highlight opportunities for further discussion and collaborations, and you'll get a chance to connect with her directly. So please help me welcome Sharon, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate, and welcome everyone. I look forward to talking about cultural differences in consumer responding with you today. So with that, let's get started. Today, my goal is to talk about, in broad terms, two differences that are observed between consumers of different cultural backgrounds. The presentation that I'm going to provide is going to be steeped in the basic psychology of how people view themselves and their social worlds, depending on their culture. Some of this will be at the national culture level. Some of this will be at the ethnic group cultural level within the US or other societies. There'll be plenty of branding and promotion and pricing examples. Many of these will come from experimental data, but this is not going to be a data-heavy presentation. My goal really is to give you a broad brush introduction to some concepts that cross-cultural consumer researchers find helpful in predicting how consumers behave. And then ultimately the goal is to allow you to take these insights and apply them to the specific marketing context that you work in. And I'm going to ask you at the end to sound off on some of those contexts and give some feedback on how this might transfer into the situations and the questions that you're dealing with. So with that, I sent out a sort of work or pre-assignment asking you to look at a few ads and to think about what values we observe. And the responses seem to capture very nicely what are the key values. So let me tie some of these ads to the kinds of values that cross-cultural researchers are interested in. Here we see an ad from Vanguard that emphasizes uniqueness and personal tailoring and self-direction. Here we see an ad from Nike that does similar things, focusing on self-direction, autonomy, and achievement. Here we see an ad from Coca-Cola that emphasizes some different themes, primarily benevolence and warmth and caring. And here we see a screenshot from SC Johnson doing something similar, emphasizing benevolence and universalism or social justice themes, caring for others. Now, these ads are good examples of ways in which marketing communications convey and appeal to different types of human values. So these are the kinds of human values that researchers who look at value distinctions have been examining for several decades. There's a great deal of research on these value clusters. And one of the things we know is that the group of values on the left, self-direction, stimulation, hedonism, achievement, and power or wealth, tend to cluster together in certain cultures. And the ones on the right, security, conformity, tradition, benevolence or kindness, and universalism or social justice, tend to cluster together in a different set of cultures. Namely, these value clusters describe what we broadly think of as individualistic cultures on the one hand, and collectivistic cultures on the other. Individualistic cultures are characterized by different self-views, different ways of viewing how oneself relates to the broader environment. In individualistic cultures, people are socialized to see themselves as separate, as unique, as distinct from others. And in fact, in the ads that emphasize these values, you saw that there were individuals, if anyone was pictured at all, like the boy jogging alone along the road in that beautiful Nike advertisement. In individualistic cultures, one's own goals are more important than other people's goals. And so for individualists, as they are socialized through life, their life goals are to become independent of others and self-reliant, to learn and cultivate one's personal preferences, and to learn to make choices based on those preferences so that you can ultimately pursue what makes you personally happy. In contrast, in collectivistic cultures, one is socialized very differently. In these cultures, the self is seen as interconnected with others, socially embedded, and mutually obligated within one's group. And as a result, you are socialized to subordinate your own personal goals to those of others, especially important others like parents and other family members or work group members. For people raised in these cultures, their life goals become fulfilling their obligations and duties as they see them, connecting with others and helping the group wherever possible, overcoming their selfish personal preferences to allow others to choose for them, and learning as a result to pay attention to context and norms so that one can better fit in and behave appropriately and choose appropriately. So one of the polls, whoops, I was going to ask you to do, has that already been? I'm going to relaunch poll 1. And I'm going to ask you to respond whether you think the US is individualistic or collectivistic. What about India? What about Korea? What about Australia? And Brazil? Okay, I'm going to end the poll in a couple seconds. And here we go. Let me share the results with you. And I would agree with your perspectives that the US is more individualistic, India is more collectivistic, Korea is more collectivistic, Australia is more individualistic, and Brazil is an interesting case. It tends to be more collectivistic, but it's collectivistic in a way that differs from countries such as India, Korea, or China, in the sense that there's less of an emphasis on hierarchy and more on an emphasis on togetherness and similarity. But these are examples of the kinds of cultural differences that we tend to observe across societies. And this is sort of broadly what we tend to classify, as individualistic societies versus collectivistic societies. So US, most of Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all of the English-speaking world basically, plus Western Europe would be classified as individualistic. Collectivistic would be East Asia, Korea, India, China, Japan. Latin America, from the limited amount of data that we have, Africa and parts of Southern Europe tend to be more collectivistic in their orientation. So individualists and collectivists differ in a number of ways, but what I'm going to focus on today is the consumer motivations that distinguish these two categories of societies and the values that they tend to pursue. And then later on, we'll talk about the thinking styles that characterize people in these two broad cultural groups. So consumer motivations differ in a number of ways. I'm going to start by talking about the self and self-presentation in more detail. That is, how people view themselves. And to get that part going, I'm going to ask you to think about a simple answer to a simple question. Who am I? Okay. I'm going to ask you to do that in the context of a self-description activity that's been given to consumers around the world many times since the 1950s. It's called the 20 Statements Test. And I'd like you to look at this and either in your own mind or on a sheet of paper, write down as many responses as you can to the question, who am I? You don't need to write any identifying information like name or specific job. And don't worry about evaluating the importance of your responses. Just write answers as they occur to you. And take maybe a half a minute or a minute to write as many as you can think of. Once you've done that, I'll ask you to share what you're comfortable sharing via the chat feature. Go ahead. I'm seeing some great chat responses come in. So whenever you're ready, go ahead and send in some of your thoughts, whichever ones you're comfortable sharing. I'm going to give you maybe another 10 seconds to send in some chat responses. Great. Okay. So the responses that I've seen seem to be beautifully exemplifying the two categories of responses that tend to be observed when people describe themselves on an activity like this as a function of their culture. So I see statements like, I'm a father, or I'm a mom, I'm a son, I'm a husband, but I also see statements like, I'm independent, I'm bookish, I'm curious, I'm serious, I'm polite, I'm creative. So this is very interesting because when a group of researchers here at the University of Illinois administered this little task to university students who were of American or Western culture of origin, they were more likely to give these kinds of self-descriptors, descriptors of personal qualities, beliefs, or behaviors that don't happen to involve other people. And I saw some of these same descriptions in your own chat responses. Here's who I am as a person. Here's how I differ from people around me. On the other hand, Chinese students tended to reference their social relationships and roles. I'm a brother, a son, I'm a dad, a mom, I'm the oldest in my family, I'm a member of MSI, I'm an employee of a given company. These were the kinds of things that they would describe. In other words, they're group relationships that with whom they're likely to experience a common fate. Okay? So this distinction really comes down to the basic level of how we think about ourselves. Individualists tend to, and are socialized to, focus on our personal qualities. Collectivists are socialized to focus on what connects them to other people and what roles they occupy. So cultural self-construal or cultural self-views differ in these basic ways. The independent self-construal, which is characteristic of individualistic cultures, views the self as a bounded, separate entity, distinct from other people and unique. And we're socialized to emphasize those unique aspects and to be motivated by them. In contrast, the interdependent self-construal, which characterizes collectivistic societies, involves viewing the self as connected with others, interdependent, that is, I'm dependent on others and they're mutually dependent on me, and obligated to do certain things for others and to fulfill our roles within our groups. Okay. So these are fundamental differences in the way that the self is construed or perceived in individualistic and collectivistic cultures. All right, so what are some implications of this? Well, one implication is that if we see ourselves differently, then our view of how to present ourselves to others may be different as well. Okay? So people who study self-presentation, that is the effort to portray a desirable image of oneself, are interested in how people kind of try to look desirable to others. So in terms of a consumer context, the question is, what is desirable to be as a consumer? How does culture influence what you think of as desirable? So we looked at this question in our own research in a number of ways. One way we looked at it is to ask people to fill out a personality scale like this one. So I'm going to give you a moment to look at the questions here, and in your own mind, take this personality test. After that, we'll see how this relates to culture and how culture influences responses to a test like this. Take a half a minute. Okay. So one of the things you might have noticed or intuited as you looked at this scale is that it's really a measure of self-presentation. That is, some of these questions, many of these questions really aren't true for anyone. The question is, what are the things that an individual will really try to emphasize about themselves in an effort to look good to other people? Oops. So self-presentation, we know, takes two different forms, and both forms were shown in that test I just gave you. Impression management, which is efforts to present one's own actions and behaviors in the most positive manner in order to appear sociable and appropriate. And that was exemplified by questions like, when I hear people talking privately, I avoid listening. Or, I never take things that don't belong to me. I've never damaged a library book or store merchandise without reporting it. Answers to these kinds of questions that basically try to deny having engaged in bad behaviors are examples of impression management. Someone who scores high in agreement with such items would be high in the psychological trait of impression management. On the other hand, there's the side of self-presentation called self-deceptive enhancement. So this involves providing inflated self-descriptions in order to appear super capable and self-reliant. So people who are high in self-deceptive enhancement tend to agree with statements like the following. My first impressions of people usually turn out to be right. Many people think that I'm exceptional. I never regret my decisions. I always know why I like things, and so on. Okay. So these are two broad but distinct categories of ways that people try to present themselves positively. And we all are interested in presenting ourselves positively on both dimensions. But as it turns out, cultural differences affect which of these dimensions might be more important. And that's true both at the national culture level and also at the level of ethnicity or subculture within the US. So let me show you some of our data on this. This was a study of self-presentation looking at Americans and Singaporeans. And what we see here is that while for everybody, self-deceptive enhancement is important, it's actually more important for Americans than Singaporeans. whereas impression management was more important for Singaporeans than for Americans. They scored higher on impression management than Americans did. Okay. You might think, well, within the US, this difference is not likely to be observed. But we then ran this same study with a group of European Americans and Asian Americans, mostly Korean Americans, here in Illinois. And we found the same kinds of differences. That is, for European Americans, self-deceptive enhancement was more important than for Asian Americans, but vice versa for impression management. There was a pretty substantial difference. All these differences are statistically significant, but there was a pretty substantial difference in how important or how much Asian Americans tried to engage in impression management in their responding relative to European Americans. So what we learn from these kinds of data is that everyone is trying to present themselves in a positive way, but how they might go about doing that and what they think reflects well on them is going to vary by their cultural background or their national culture. For the individual self, for individualists like Westerners, the goal is to appear self-reliant and capable. For collectivists, or people from East Asia, for instance, the goal is to appear sociable and normatively appropriate, not violate norms, okay? So self-presentation matters to all of us, but what that means depends on our culture. The next thing I want to talk about is how these kinds of differences then carry over to the choices that we make and the way in which we make them. So one of the findings broadly from the research is that the importance of self-expression varies across cultures, as does the importance of connecting to others. We view our choices through these cultural lenses. Okay? So I'll talk a bit about self-expression versus adaptation and the goal of standing out versus fitting in. First, I want to share with you a quick quote from a set of researchers who've been looking at self-expression through choice. So they note that for those from cultural contexts where people place emphasis on thoughts and feelings, that is, Western cultural contexts, expressing preference through choice is a way of expressing their character. Which car you select, which type of coffee you drink, and so on, is a way of communicating about your own unique self. In contrast, for those from cultural contexts where people do not emphasize internal attributes, what is expressed through choice does not carry much cultural importance. Okay? The choices that you make don't reveal as much about you, largely because you're more socialized to make those choices in reference to what people around you think is important. So let me give you one example of a study that helps to establish this broad observation. In a study of Asian American and Anglo-American children in schools in San Francisco, kids were given a chance to choose puzzles to play with. And they were told in these experiments that either they could choose what they want, or their mom had selected for them a puzzle that she thought they would like, or the experimenter had selected for them a puzzle they thought the kid would like. How kids reacted to the option to make their own choice versus to choose what someone else selected for them depended on the cultural background of the child. So for Asian American children, choosing according to the preferences of close others, like their mom, was more satisfying. And it was more likely to motivate behavior, like persisting on a puzzle that was difficult, versus choosing according to personal preferences. In other words, for Asian American children, if mom said she thought you'd like this puzzle, the child was more satisfied with that puzzle and more likely to work that puzzle longer. The reverse was true for European American children. For these kids, having someone else choose for them was demotivating. That is, they were more motivated by being able to make their own selection of puzzle to play with and more likely to persist on that puzzle if they had been allowed to make their own choice. In another study looking at pen choice, researchers were interested in how people would react when something that they chose turned out to be unavailable or was taken away from them. Okay, so in this study, participants from North America and from India were placed in one of two conditions. In the free choice condition, they were presented with 5 attractive black gel pens, and they were asked to choose a pen for themselves. And then they tested their chosen pen on the first page of a questionnaire, and they evaluated the pen itself. Participants in another condition had their choice usurped. That is, after they initially chose and tested a pen for themselves, but before they turned the page, the experimenter interrupted them and took away their chosen pen, saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, you can't have that one. That's the last of its kind I've got. Here, please take this one." Okay, so in one condition, they had made their own choice. In the other condition, the choice they had made had been usurped by another individual, in this case, a person in authority. What they were interested in, these researchers, Savani, Marcus, and Connor, were how people would evaluate the pens. And what they found is that North Americans evaluated the chosen pens more positively, the pens that they picked for themselves, than they evaluated pens assigned to them by another person. Whereas people from India liked the pens to the exact same extent, regardless of who chose it for them. Having their choice usurped did not make them feel any less positive toward the pen. Okay. So I'd like to ask you to respond to a simple poll. Who do you think is more likely to choose what they prefer? Let's see, do I have? Okay, who do you think is more likely to choose what they prefer? Is it people from an individualistic culture? Or, I'm sorry, I shared the wrong poll with you. Sorry about that. Let me try that again. There we go. Okay, who's more likely to choose what they prefer? People from an individualistic culture or people from a collectivistic culture? Take another second. Okay, and I will share the results. And your responses are perfect. 100% of you got the right answer. The people more likely to choose what they prefer would be individualists. And I'm going to show you some data on this, data collected from around the world in the context of green marketing choices, green consumer choices of various types. So, okay. I'm going to show you some data that were collected in the US in comparison to Japan. I won't show you data from China, but they show very similar results. So you can basically view these as comparisons of Western and Eastern consumers. So here was a study that looked at data from the World Values Survey. This is a survey conducted in 48 countries, over 67,000 respondents. And they looked at the degree of individualism of each of these 48 cultures. And they looked at the degree to which responses on personal preferences predicted responses on a choice question. So the personal preference question was, how serious do you consider global warming or the greenhouse effect to be for the world as a whole? Okay, very serious to not serious at all. And then in the later part of the survey, they were asked, would you give part of your income if you were certain that the money would be used to prevent environmental pollution? So this was support of a particular policy. And here are the results. And what you can see is that it arrays nicely by the cultural characteristics of the countries involved. For instance, the United States, Australia, Canada, Sweden, Switzerland, Finland, Germany, Norway, these are quite individualistic countries. For those individualistic countries, there was a greater correlation between their statements about how serious they thought greenhouse gases and global warming is, and how likely they were to support environmental action. Okay? In contrast, for countries such as Indonesia, South Korea, Thailand, Vietnam, China, Peru, Trinidad and Tobago, Taiwan, countries that vary in their political systems and their economies, there was very little relationship between their personal preferences and the choices they said they would make. Okay. In other words, many of you are in marketing research contexts. We tend to ask people for their preferences all the time in our surveys, but it turns out that if you know what consumers in a country prefer, if they're collectivistic, you actually know less about what they plan to do than if they're individualistic. In other words, if they're collectivistic, their statements about their own preferences don't necessarily have the same degree of predictive value. Now, these researchers whose data I'm showing you followed this study up with an experiment looking at US and Japanese participants. And in this one, they asked people to actually indicate specific choices. So they asked a similar personal preference question about how much people thought the ecological crisis facing humankind is a serious one. And then they looked at choices, the proportion of green versus not green products that people chose. So I'll show you examples of those. Those included shampoo, cups, coffee, shopping bags, water bottles, notebooks. And one key feature distinguished which product was environmentally friendly, for instance, whether ingredients for shampoo were biodegradable or not. And the environmentally friendly one was also priced slightly higher. So they asked people in the US and Japan, which of these two would you prefer if you were making choices and you had narrowed them down to these two options? After people made these choices, they looked at the relationship between the concern statement that they had made about the environment and their likelihood of choosing pro-environmental products across these categories. And here's what they found collapsed across the product categories, namely that environmental concern predicted environmentally friendly consumer choice only for European Americans, not for Japanese. Okay. So again, this suggests that knowing what people say is their preference is less valuable in terms of predictive analytics when you're talking about consumers from collectivistic cultures than consumers from individualistic cultures. Okay, so these are examples of evidence about how valuable is the relationship between attitudes or preferences and behaviors. That is, how much do we learn from understanding people's preferences? Now I'm going to turn to some research on how people or what people choose when they make their choices. That is, what do they prefer to choose when they get to make the choice on their own? So in this study, researchers recruited participants at San Francisco International Airport, at the cafeteria, at the gates, and in the waiting areas. And they asked them to participate in a study. And as they prepared to participate in this survey, they were given a choice of pens to select as a gift. Okay. So this is an example of the kind of choices that they were given. And what the researchers were interested in is not so much their answers to a later survey, but rather, which pen would they choose? Would they choose the pen that stands out, or would they choose the pen that fits in? And as you might expect, the percent who chose the uncommon pen, the one that was 1 out of 4 choices, 1 orange, 4 green, or 1 green, 4 orange, differed by culture. Okay, so European Americans were more likely to choose the unique color pen, the pen that stood out. East Asians were more likely to conform, to choose the common pen, as opposed to the one that stood out. We see this on the left side of this screen when we make this 1-4 comparison that I showed you in the array of pens here, okay? But you might say, well, people might not have chosen the orange pen out of courtesy. They didn't want to take the researchers' last one. So to try and deal with this problem, the researchers did another version of the study where they had 2 orange and 3 green. In other words, it would not have been the last pen that people took. And in that context, the 2-3 context you see on the right, the same results emerged. European Americans were more likely to choose the pen that was more unique, the minority color, whereas East Asians were more likely to choose the common pen. Okay. Now, these researchers followed this with a content analysis of advertisements because they wondered to what extent would this preference for uniqueness versus for some sort of conformity be observable in the everyday cultural environment, in particular in the environment of advertisements seen in magazines. So they did a content analysis comparing US and Korean magazine ads, where coders made ratings of ads depending on whether the ad had conformity themes or uniqueness themes. So here are examples of uniqueness themes, the one I showed you before. Here's an example that is not high in uniqueness. And here are a couple of examples from Korea, where the first ad emphasizes that it's difficult to grow alone, but we can do it. This is for Woori Bank. Woori in Korean means we. The second ad is emphasizing tradition. It says now it's been 90 years since we started. So it's about tradition and continuity. And so the question was, do these themes really reliably differ across consumers in the US and Korea? And the answer is yes. Korean ads tended to have much more conformity themes than uniqueness themes. American ads tended to emphasize uniqueness more than conformity. We did our own content analysis of ads looking at 6 different magazines in multiple consumer categories, and we found very similar results. That is, the ads that tend to run in each culture tend to reflect the cultural themes that are important to individualists in the US or collectivists in Korea. Okay. So to sum up, the choices that consumers make are influenced by culture. For individualists, choices express the self and set the self apart from others. And so being able to make one's own choices is important and motivating. And when you can make your choices, you choose things that set you apart. But for collectivists, choices connect one to other people. So you're happy to have other people choose for you. It's not upsetting. And if it's someone important to you, like your mother, it's actually motivating. And when you're allowed to make your own choices, you tend to make things that connect you to other people or help you to fit in with them. So let's go on to the third set of examples of consumer motivation. Let's see how some of these differences play out in the digital world. Here we're going to see differences in self-expression versus focus on norms, and what information, how this influences the information that consumers seek out in digital spaces. So here's a study of discussion board word of mouth. This study investigated the behavior of people who visited 6 discussion boards with a focus on digital photography. And these discussion boards are based on 6 different internet portals, eBay, Yahoo, and Google in the US, and EachNet, Sina, and NetEase in China. Okay. So these researchers analyzed the content of almost 6,000 discussion postings during a specific set of 90-day periods. And what they found is that the things that people posted differed by culture. So the China-based discussion boards compared to the US-based ones were characterized by a higher frequency of requests for product recommendations. That is, please tell me what you think I should buy, or tell me how you think I should use my camera lens. US-based discussion boards compared to the China boards were characterized by a higher number of recommendations given per request. That is, providing personal opinions. Here's what I think to other people. Okay. So Americans were more likely to say, or people posting on American discussion boards were more likely to say, here's my point of view, and express themselves, than people posting to Chinese boards And by contrast, people posting to Chinese boards were more likely to ask about what other people's opinions were. So that's one piece of evidence suggesting that what consumers are seeking out when they're looking to make product selections is going to differ reliably by culture. Let's look at some other examples that back this conclusion up. Here was a study comparing people doing online textbook shopping in Australia and in Hong Kong. So word of mouth, just as it is on discussion boards, is very important in evaluating a retailer, including an online retailer. So here on the website of a college bookstore, researchers had either placed a quote from other students, so in other words, peer endorsements, or they did not. And they looked to see how much the peer endorsements influenced the trust that people had in the internet retailer, okay? So here at the bottom left, you can see a comment by a customer. So in this case, the comment was another student at the same university endorsing the brand. And what they found is that the impact of these peer customer endorsements on the trust in the retailer was stronger for consumers in Hong Kong than for consumers in Australia. At the same time, affiliation with the portal, in this case Yahoo, was effective only in the Australian site. So what mattered to Hong Kong participants was what other people thought, people who were their peers, but less so for people in Australia. For them, it was more about portal affiliation in this case. Here's another study that looked at how these differences play out in the way that websites are typically structured, that is, in the features that appear on corporate websites. This was a content analysis of Western compared to Eastern corporate websites that was conducted to examine the types of interactivity that marketers facilitated. The sample included 200 corporate business websites, 50 each from US, UK, Japanese, and South Korean national advertisers' websites. So they chose the 50 largest companies, the 50 largest national advertisers in each society, and they looked at analyzed their websites. And what did they find? I'll walk you through this. So they found that there were differences across 3 different kinds of interaction. So consumer message interaction would be things like keyword search, personal choice helpers, virtual reality displays, dealer locators, and things like that. Stuff that helps you to go about your business and figure out how to make a purchase or learn more about the product. Consumer marketer interactivity was things like site surveys, online orders, order status tracking, online problem diagnostics, and things like that. So again, independent problem solving kinds of features. And what they find is that consumer message interactivity and consumer marketer interactivity, the blue and the red bars here, were more prevalent in the websites of top national advertisers in the West, advertisers like US, UK, Japan, and South Korea. Okay. On the other hand, consumer interactivity varied by consumer interaction was things like user group communities, electronic postcards, and online chatting with other consumers. Okay, and for that, the green bars, those were more prevalent in South Korea and Japan compared to the US and UK. In other words, everyone had the consumer message and consumer marketing interactivity features, but features that connected consumers to each other were more prevalent in South Korea and Japan than in the UK and the US. Here's an example from the website of LG, emphasizing opportunities to ask the community and get their questions answered that way. I want to turn now to an online poll. I'm going to ask you to tell me why you think eBay, when they made their big move into China in 2004, underperformed its expectations. So you might remember that in 2004, the San Jose online auctioning giant decided to enter the Chinese market. So eBay bought a local company, EachNet, and switched it to the eBay platform and expected to sweep China in short order. After all, they had dominated other countries' markets, so why not China? Unfortunately, 2 years later, they shut down their portal, abandoning the Chinese auction market, or at least abandoning efforts to sell to the Chinese. And a local competitor, Taobao, went on to take over most of the local market share. So the poll I want to ask you to respond to is why? Why did eBay lose out to Taobao? What did they miss? And I'm going to ask you to take a minute to respond via the chat function. I'll give you a minute to do that. Good answers so far. If you could take another few seconds. As you do that, I think I'm going to swap out my earbuds for a different microphone because I might lose power. Okay, Urbana, can you confirm you can hear me?
Yep, we can still hear you.
Okay, Urbana?
Yep, we can still hear you.
Hear me? That's so good responses so far. Let me move on. As many of you suggested, there wasn't a reliable personal recommendation method. That is, there was an overall lack of understanding of the value of consumer-to-consumer interactivity. So the difference between Taobao and eBay is that Taobao allowed buyers and sellers to chat over instant messaging, while eBay did not. So what buyers really wanted to do was get to know the sellers, according to a professor at Temple University who looked into this. So in China, business is not just business, it's social.
And what in building Taobao, Jack Ma, the founder, understood was the concept of swift guanxi, a swift building of trust between people. And he equipped his online marketplace with tools that allow this kind of relationship to grow. So consumers on Taobao spent an average of 45 minutes using what the researchers called computer-mediated recommendation technologies, which is basically sellers questions.
Hey Sharon, we're having some trouble hearing you. Maybe you can dial in with your phone. I'll send you the instructions for that.
Let me just try my earbuds again. And sorry about that.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, great.
Great.
All right. So let me go back just to wrap up this thought. So in building Taobao, the idea was providing consumer to consumer interactivity was absolutely crucial, right? Allowing sellers and buyers to ask each other questions about themselves. eBay's developers missed this critical importance of the Chinese concept of guanxi. And without equipping the site for that, they were not positioned for success. So to wrap up this part, the marketing implications of understanding cultural values and motivations that differ between individualists and collectivists could be summed up like this. When targeting individualists, consider the pursuit of self-interest, consider the motive to stand out, to be unique, and to be distinct, and provide consumers with opportunities to express themselves and to address their personal needs. Emphasize choosing for oneself as opposed to having others choose for you. When targeting collectivists, consider the pursuit of group interests. Harmony, conformity, security are important values. And provide information on other people's views and norms. Facilitate people's connections to others. Don't worry so much about self-expression. Worry more about allowing the consumer to connect with others and feel that they're part of a larger group. As we transition to the next part, I want to invite you to share any observations or questions that you have via chat. So if you would take a few seconds to do that, and then we'll move to part 2, thinking style. Okay, I'm going to take that as you're ready to move on. So let's talk about thinking style. What about cognition? Does culture influence how people think? And does everyone perceive, categorize, and reason in the same way? Of course, you know that the answer is going to be no. There are differences. And to illustrate those differences, I want you to take a second to look at your computer screen. Ready? Now, what do you notice? Please respond in the chat regarding what you noticed about the display you just observed. So what I'm seeing is comments about the water, bright green fish, colorful, a few fish in green water, green background, frog, 3 fish, bubbles, plants. I like that response, okay? So I'm gonna show you that image again, just by way of telling you you know, what you noticed and maybe show you what you missed. This was the display, definitely pixelated, as you pointed out. I just wanted to illustrate what researchers who studied people in the US and Japan observed about the differences in what people noticed. Some of you talked about background elements. Some of you talked about foreground elements like the big fish near the top, okay? And what researchers who did this work found is that Japanese participants looked more at the background and the relationships between objects, and they tended to recall 60% more of the background than American participants did. American participants, in contrast, tended to focus on the biggest, shiniest focal fish. Okay. Now, why does that matter? Well, this is one example of a basic difference in thinking style, in perception. Westerners are more likely to focus on an object within the context. That's what an analytic thinking style teaches you to do. East Asians and other non-Westerners are more likely to attend to the context itself, in this case, the background. The green water, the seaweed, the bubbles. This is what holistic thinking involves. In other words, one way of perceiving your visual field is exemplified by the Where's Waldo puzzle. Okay, this is a familiar game. Your goal is to find the embedded object by ignoring all kinds of unimportant contextual information in the background. Take a second and find Where's Waldo. I bet you most of you already have. You know that he's right square in the middle of the screen. Okay. We all know how to do this, but some of us do this more easily than others. In contrast, there's another way of perceiving, and that is to look at the entire scene and observe how things connect together. So I'm going to show you a commercial from American Express that exemplifies this different way of perceiving. Here we go. Okay, so to understand this ad, whoops, you have to be able to tie elements together. You have to be able to perceive things in a new way. So here's another way of perceiving. Whoops. Here you had to make up or come up with a gestalt or holistic impression of the images that ties different elements on the screen together. So the ad for American Express we just saw by Ogilvy and Mather addresses the benefits of purchase protection. But to understand the message of the ad, you have to recognize that there are faces embedded in it and that they're getting happier as the commercial progresses. And you can only do that by looking at the ad holistically. Here's another example. So back to the Coca-Cola ad we saw at the beginning. And here's another reason why I really love this ad, because you have to look at it holistically to recognize that the faces and the space between them form the bottle, the iconic Coca-Cola bottle. Okay? This is the classic Gestalt image presented to consumers. Now, why do these two ways of perceiving things matter? Well, because they relate to two ways in which we tend to think about the world. Do we separate and distinguish between elements like products, or do we connect and integrate them to make them into a whole? People with an analytic thinking style, they tend to focus on separating individual objects from their context and focusing on the object's distinct attributes. And then they use this information to assign things to mutually exclusive categories. And then analytic thinkers, as a result, tend to use information about an object's category to explain and to predict events. Okay. Holistic thinkers, on the other hand, tend to adopt a big picture view of the world. They emphasize the interconnectedness between individual objects in the context. As a result, holistic thinkers often explain and predict events based on contextual factors. People from non-Western cultures are more likely to construe themselves as interdependent with others, and as a result, they tend to adopt a holistic thinking style, which influences their tendency to see connections or relationships between things in their environment. So let me illustrate why these differences matter for marketers. Let's imagine that this bowl of shiny balls is a product. So if you asked, what's the product in this situation? It would be obvious. The answer would be obvious. It's that thing on the table. We can easily grasp that there's an item in the foreground, this bowl, with a set of items inside. And then we can mentally erase the context, the table on which it's displayed, right? So we're focused on the foreground. It's perceived as independent of the context. And that makes that foreground item feel stable, unchanging, okay? But in a holistic way of thinking, the product is contextualized in its background. Okay? The same thing is viewed as different, whether it's displayed as it is here on a marble table or displayed on a wooden table. Okay? So researchers, Juliet Zhu and Joan Myers-Levy, the researchers who did this work, showed that for people who think holistically, the item's display context makes a difference to the item. That is, the context and its properties are infused into the properties of the focal item. In one study, they activated a Western independent concept in some people, or an Eastern interdependent way of thinking in others. And then they asked consumers to evaluate a coffee mug that was either displayed on a glass or a wooden table. So participants in the Eastern interdependent condition connected the product with its context. They evaluated the mug as more trendy when it was on a glass table, but more natural when it was placed on a wooden table. Okay. However, participants in the independent condition distinguished the mug from its background. They separated the foreground from the background. They evaluated the mug as more trendy when it was placed on a wooden table, but more natural when it was placed on a glass table. Now, this could really matter in retail settings because differences in consumer thinking styles can affect the way product perceptions change when your distribution strategy changes. So when the background elements like the retailer's display context or the retailer's reputation changes, it affects the way the product is perceived for some consumers, but not for others. Okay, again, analytic thinkers who are Western and independent are more likely to view a product and its display context as separate elements. Holistic thinkers tend to connect the display context and the product and see them as continuous parts of a larger whole. That connection between the display context and the product is illustrated here in a shop window I saw in Milan this summer, right? So these Valentino bags are not separate from their display context. They are holistically connected to it. And let me tell you about a study that we did that showed how this can matter in a retail context. So cultures may differ in terms of how they use information in a retail setting to make judgments. So even if a consumer isn't physically in a store, he or she might use information about the retailer, like the store's reputation, to make judgments about the product inside the store. Reputation of a retailer is part of the context in which a brand is sold. So in one study, we had people imagine the exact same GE microwave oven at the same price point with same features, but we asked them to think about it as being sold either at Kmart or at Marshall Field's. This was done a few years ago, so those stores were still in existence. Okay? And we were interested in whether they were going to connect the store reputation to the brand reputation. And what we found is that when people were led to think in a collectivistic way, they connected the GE microwave to the reputation of the store, viewing the quality of the microwave as significantly higher when it was being sold at Marshall Field's than when they were told it was being sold at Kmart. Okay? That was not the case for individualistic consumers. These differences, though they look like differences, were actually not statistically significant. So if you look at the dull navy colored bars, you can see that for collectivistic consumers, the reputation of the store made a significant difference in how they viewed the products displayed inside. Another set of studies looked at how context influenced the actual physical cravings that people have for products. So they showed consumers ads for products, either with an occasion setting cue in the background, in this case, this chocolate bar with a theater in the background. In another study, they used a cheese pizza with a brick oven pizzeria pictured in the background. Or in the other condition, they saw the exact same product image, but no background, just plain. Okay, so a plain chocolate bar or a plain cheese pizza, no background. So the question is, which of these two ads makes consumers feel more tempted, more craving of the product itself? It turns out that the answer depends on whether those consumers are thinking analytically or holistically. So what they found is that for holistic thinkers, cravings were stronger when there was an occasion setting cue pictured in the ad than when there was no cue pictured in the ad, okay? In other words, holistic thinkers crave the product more when a context was provided that made sense for consuming the product. And this did not matter for analytic thinkers. Now, how did they know about craving? They didn't ask people, how much do you crave this chocolate bar or this pizza? They actually measured salivation by having people put dental rolls in their mouths that they then afterwards weighed. And they found that people salivated more if they were holistic thinkers when they saw a product with an occasion setting cue in the ad than without such a cue. But that there was no significant difference for analytic thinkers. Giving them a context or not giving them a context didn't matter in how much they salivated. So that's kind of a cool study in that it doesn't rely on self-reports at all, but it does show you that holistic versus analytic thinking style influences how much the context matters for the way the product or brand is perceived. So I want to move on now from perceiving to categorizing. And here I'm going to give you a short poll where I'm going to ask you to respond in the text. Okay? So I'm going to illustrate categorization with this simple task. Have a look at the top row here above the line. Which two of each three things pictured above the line go together? Please send me your answer in the chat. Which two go together in the top line? So I'm seeing several answers roll in. This is great. Take another 2 seconds. So everyone who has answered said that the animals go together, the barnyard animals, the cow and the chicken. Okay, let's go to the next line, below the black line. Which two in this row go together? Take another couple of seconds. Okay, so most of you said the man and the woman go together because they're adults. Okay, so what's interesting here is that the way people categorize actually does depend on their cultural background. So a Western style of categorization means that you categorize based on formal logic and shared attributes like barnyard animals or adults. But Easterners or holistic thinkers tend to categorize based on relationships between objects. So they would actually categorize the cow and the grass together because the cow eats the grass. Or they would categorize the woman and the baby together. The mom takes care of the baby. Or the man and the baby, as some of you did. Okay? In other words, that's a nurturing relationship. So they would classify things in terms of that relationship rather than the shared features that two adults might have or two barnyard animals might have. Okay. Now that's startling in itself, but what does that mean for the way that people think about brands? Because brands are categories. Well, it turns out that brands and brand extensions are affected by similar kinds of processes. So let me ask you, we know that marketers need to extend their brands and leverage successful brands all the time. So what if Coca-Cola decided to reach into a new snack food category? What if Coca-Cola made Coke popcorn? Would you eat that brand? Would you buy Coke popcorn? Well, it turns out that classic branding research would tell you, no, that would not be a good idea because popcorn doesn't fit with the classic features of Coca-Cola that you come to associate with it, its flavor, its refreshment, and so on. Okay? But cross-cultural research has shown that thinking style affects how people categorize objects, including brands. So it affects whether people think that Coke popcorn is going to have the same flavor as Coke. In fact, holistic thinkers may not assume that it has the same flavor at all. They may simply assume that the two things share a usage occasion, like I can consume both at the movies. And as it turns out, researchers have shown that that's exactly the difference that's observed. Americans tend to reject extensions that don't fit with the parent brand. For instance, researchers looking at this looked at well-known brands like McDonald's, extending hypothetically into close extensions like onion rings or distant extensions like razors. It's a very distant extension, right? So Americans tended to reject the extensions that didn't fit with the parent brand. They said that's not what McDonald's is about. But people from India in this study perceived more fit. That is, they focused on the relationships between the parent brand and its extension. They saw more links between them and they reacted more favorably. So in one example, McDonald's was considering extending to chocolate bars, which was perceived as a distant extension by people in general. But for Indian consumers, they said, oh, it would be liked by kids, just like McDonald's food is. And it makes sense because chocolate would be an inexpensive addition to the dessert menu. Whereas American consumers were more likely to say McDonald's is into fast food, not candy. That doesn't work. Okay. Now, another interesting thing about this study is that they didn't stop, these researchers, Monga and John, did not stop by just looking at Americans and Indians. They looked at whether thinking style was responsible for this difference. So they actually activated different thinking styles in consumers. They activated either this analytic mindset of separating and distinguishing, or this holistic mindset of connecting and integrating. And then after that process in their experiment, they showed people these same kinds of brand extensions. And they found that activating holistic thinking actually led people to become more favorable toward the brand extensions. People who, even Americans, became more favorable to the brand extensions, even distant extensions like McDonald's chocolate or McDonald's razors. And other research has suggested that holistic thinkers have a relational processing advantage. So they can see more links between different parts of the same category. They can connect things together in a more effective way. Some other work has looked at the implications for downward brand extensions. For instance, what would happen if BMW came out with either a less expensive line, in this case, the BMW 228e, or a more expensive line, the 688i, okay? And they found that holistic thinkers were less sensitive to downward line extensions. That is, those extensions did not tend to dilute the brand the way they did for analytic thinkers. Analytic thinkers tended to separate the core parent brand from its extension and perceive a non-fit. But holistic thinkers were more willing to accept the downward line extension, okay? So here we see that holistic thinkers, as shown in the flat line at the top, didn't view the upward and downward line extension as having more implications for the parent brand image. But analytic thinkers did. They tended to separate the downward extension from the parent brand and think in terms of the parent brand now no longer fitting that downward extension. I'm going to skip this and wrap this section up by saying that what we learn about brand extension success from research on how culture affects categorization is that for holistic thinkers, strong brands can be leveraged for more distant extensions. And that anything you do that encourages holistic thinking can help to stimulate the recognition of linkages in people's minds between the parent brand and the extensions. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip a couple of things and talk about implications for retailing and pricing. So holistic thinkers recognize more relationships. Does that mean that they're going to recognize cross-channel relationships more or price quality relationships more? Short answer is yes. If you look at people making connections across channels, for instance, brick and mortar stores versus their online versions, holistic thinkers who tend to focus on relationships between things also tend to focus on the relationship between a physical retail store and its corresponding digital channels. And they form preferences by transferring their feelings about the physical store to the online store. So for instance, I like Best Buy, so bestbuy.com must also be good. Okay. In contrast, analytic thinkers who tend to categorize using either or decision rules tend to distinguish between physical and online channels. They're just in different categories. Okay. So they might like Best Buy, the physical store, because of its selection. They might like the online store because it has fast download times. But those are not going to be transferable attributes across the brick and mortar and the digital channel. In our own research, we also found that people who think holistically tend to connect price and quality more strongly. So we did a survey among consumers in India and the US, and we found that Indians are more likely to believe that you get what you pay for. That is, they're more likely to believe that a higher priced brand is also a higher quality or more desirable. We also found that ethnicity predicts price quality connections in similar ways. So for consumers who are of Asian or Hispanic heritage, they tended to view the price of a clock as being a better indicator of its quality than Anglo-Caucasians did. We also did a study where we got people to think either analytically or holistically. And by activating holistic thinking, we got a much stronger relationship between price and quality in both ethnic groups. That is, they connected the price of a calculator to its quality much more when they were thinking holistically. And that was true across both ethnic groups. I'm going to skip ahead to implications for brand name goods. So moving to the brand level, there's research consistent with these findings there too. So branded products versus cheaper private label brands. What researchers find is that market share percentages for private label brands across over 20 countries worldwide correlate positively with individualism. In other words, people in collectivistic cultures are more likely to prefer national or global brands, presumably because they see higher quality associations. People in individualistic cultures are more open to private label brands. And this is observed in large-scale data across many countries, and it's also observed in experiments done at the ethnic group level, showing similar effects as a function of people's cultural background in the US. So to wrap up these differences, cultures differ in their perceptions or patterns of perception, of categorization, and of reasoning. And one can leverage these differences in thinking styles in order to manage brands, whether it's communication or managing branding and brand extension decisions, or managing pricing and responses to higher price points. At this point, I'd like to invite you to share your own observations and questions by chat. And I'd really like to find out, especially because I know a number of you, your roles are heavily involved in marketing research. I would love to know whether your own data or observations mirror any of the ones I've described to you, or whether you have other questions that you'd like to know about. So please send me a comment via chat. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yep, I can hear you.
Perfect. Okay, as you think about any comments you might have, I also want to thank you for your attention and invite you to reach out to me with any questions that you have privately. In particular, I would love to connect with people who have an interest in and data around cultural differences in their consumers, and talk with you about ways that you might be able to enhance the insights that you gain from those data in order to understand how these cultural differences might influence the way your consumers respond in retail context, branding context, service context, and the like. My contact information is listed on the left, so you can reach out to me any number of ways. And now I'm going to read a couple of the questions that came in. One is, how do you view and parse out the complexity of multiple cultures coming together? For instance, Asian American millennials. Right? That's a really great question. And I think that there's the best way to do that is simply to collect the data and see whether these generational categories really make a difference. But the one observation I would have is that even though generation matters, a lot of the research that we have actually looks at millennials as opposed to older consumers. And when we have data that compare them to older consumers, we don't see big differences. We tend to see that ethnicity is more likely to be a driver than generation or cohort. However, I think it's very important to look at cohorts and to better slice these data by those intersections of people's experiences, intersections that might include gender and race. Not only cultural background. So thank you for that question, and I would love to talk more about it. Another question was the study in which saliva was measured. Did any studies utilize fMRIs, so brain scans, and were there differences in decisions made cognitively versus subliminally? So that's really interesting too.
There is quite a bit of cultural neuroscience work being done, and that does tend to support the kinds of differences that I've been talking about, the sort of things that activate regions of the brain that have to do with motivation and interest and appetitive instincts, like, you know, temptation versus fear. These kinds of things do show patterns as a function of culture. We don't tend to look so much at cognitive, at sort of supraliminal versus subliminal as much, but the limited amounts of data that do that tend to show similar kinds of effects as well. So what I like about the saliva data, as you're pointing out, is that this doesn't depend on self-report. It's a fairly automatic process, whether you find something tempting and salivate in response to it or not. I think we need more and more such data in our, in our toolkit in order to be able to, make sure that all of these findings relate to the different levels at which people respond to problems. Thank you very much, and thank you for the nice comments. I'm glad you enjoyed the presentation, and I enjoyed providing it. Again, I would love to reach out to anyone, so please contact me if you have further questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sharon, and thank you for everyone for joining us. We encourage you to reach out to Sharon for collaboration ideas or project ideas, or if you have any questions or examples on things that you're working on that you'd love her insight, feel free to reach out directly to Sharon or through us. Academics make great partners, and Sharon is a wonderful resource for you. After the session, we'll be sending along some additional materials that Sharon will pull for us. Be sure to respond to the feedback poll there. And then our next intensive will be on December 10th on how to create optimal marketing budget allocation with and without data. So we encourage you to sign up or send that information along to your colleagues. Thank you so much for your active participation, and we will see you again soon. Thank you again, Sharon.